Hi guys, and welcome to this tutorial where we're going to be looking at how to create this Praxis effect. It's a flat energy ring and it looks great on its own, or it's also good as part of a larger explosion composition. It's called a Praxis effect because it was made famous in Star Trek 6, and in that they blew up a moon called Praxis where they used this effect. Personally, I'm more familiar with this effect from Star Wars, where they used it in the digitally remastered versions when the Death Star exploded. As I said, it works great on its own, and this example here shows it very clearly. Although this was actually created for a different project where it was going to be integrated into a scene, and I can show you that here. As you can see, it integrates very nicely in with the other elements in the scene, and we'll look at how to achieve that later on. So a quick shout out to AEPLUG, who did a tutorial that this one is kind of based on a little bit, although we've added our own elements to it, and their original was quite sort of fiery and turbulent, whereas we've made changes to make it smoother and more of an energy blast. Also, the original was in what I believe to be Russian, so this should be easier for English speaking people to follow along. But I will include the link to the AEPLUG version of the tutorial in the details below. Okay, so let's get started. It's clearly a 3D element in After Effects, and whether or not we're going to be integrating this into a pre-existing scene or using it as here as a standalone element, the process is exactly the same either way. So let's take a look at the starting point, which is to create the actual blast itself. So I'll stop this, and if I select it, you can see it's simply a 3D plane using the Add Blend mode with some effects applied on top. We'll look at these effects in more detail towards the end of the tutorial, but for now we'll turn them off one by one, and then we can see the effect that each one is having on the composition. So we'll turn off Glow, and then we'll turn off Tritone, and then finally we'll turn off the Curves Adjustment layer. And if I also turn off the background elements as well, then we can see the ring in its bare state. And with this being a 3D layer, we can rotate this around in 3D space, and we can even zoom in and out using the transform controls. So if I scrub the time slider, you can see what we're dealing with in 3D. Now here is the 2D composition that creates the ring, and this is what we're going to focus on in this tutorial, is looking at creating this animating composition. And like most things in After Effects, it's actually quite simple and straightforward. So we'll get started in a new composition. Okay, so we'll go to Project and we'll select New Composition, and we'll call this one Build Ring, and we'll set the dimensions to 4000 by 4000, and the background colour we'll just leave as black. So here is our new composition, and we're going to create a new solid. So we'll call this one Ring, and black again is fine, and we're going to now apply a effect to this, and we're going to select the circle effect in this case. So we'll select the Effects tab, and we'll drag circle into here. And as you can see, we can adjust the radius of the circle using this slider. Okay, so if we turn on transparency, you'll see that this circle is actually on a transparent background. Now, for blending modes later on, we will need black to be in the composition. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the blending mode from none to normal. And this will actually make it have a black background. And then the other thing we need to do at this point in time is kind of decide how long we want our actual explosion to be. Now I think, you know, sort of 2 seconds is probably about right. So I'm going to change my composition time to this and just dragging the slider and then making it fill my composition window. So you see we can adjust the radius here. And the other thing we want to do is under edge is we can select thickness, and this will give us a ring effect, and we can adjust the thickness of the ring. The other thing we can do is affect the feathering of both the outer edge and also the inner edge. And these are the primary elements that we're going to be using and animating to do our explosion. So first of all, I want to kind of set it up to look how I want my feel of my explosion to seem at its prime. So we can adjust the size and the inner feather and just getting my radius to sort of how I want my explosion to look at its prime moment. So as I mentioned, what we're going to be animating is the radius and the thickness and the feathering. So I'm going to click the stopwatch to add keyframes for these elements. So we'll start with radius, thickness, the feather outer edge and the inner edge. Now if we come down to the ring layer and press U, it will expand all the animated tracks. So it will expand all the tracks that currently have any keyframes active on them. The way I remember that keyboard shortcut is expand all available animated keys. It has no U in it whatsoever, so it's up to you to remember. So yeah, well done, great job to whoever was assigning keyboard shortcuts that day. So I'm going to select those keyframes that we've just created and I'm going to slide them along on the timeline. And I'm going to put them towards the middle. In actual fact, this is sort of our explosion at its prime, so I'll slide it more towards the end for now. So I'll bring my time frame back to 0 and I will bring my radius right down. So come all the way down, and my thickness will need to come down too. And then also trying to reduce my feathering almost to 0. And you can see the radius still needs to come down the last little bit. And there we go. So now as I drag my time slider, you can see our energy ring developing. It's going boom here, and I probably want it to have a slightly smaller hole at this point, so I'll do that by increasing the thickness and perhaps increase my feathering a little bit. It's now coming through and going kaboom, so looking quite good. Now I need at the end of the animation for the black centre of the ring to actually have expanded out and to be larger than the frame of the animation. And you'll see why in a moment. So I'm going to grab these keyframes here, and these are my explosion at its prime. So I'll slide those in more towards the middle of the animation. And then I'll go to my last frame and I will increase the radius out so that the black hole is beyond the bounds of the composition. And don't worry too much about these white corners. We'll trim those off in a moment. We can now take a look at the explosion by, if we press 0, it would do as a preview RAM, and then it will take a moment to calculate, and then we'll have a real-time playback. And you can see our timing here, it's kind of accelerating towards the end. And in the final one, we really want it to be accelerating at the start and then slowing off. And we can achieve all this just by sliding some keyframes around. So we already have some keyframes here, and if I just add a radius keyframe as well, so just click, and then if we slide the keyframes left a little bit, then it will get to that point a little bit sooner. We'll also select the keyframes for at its prime, and we'll drag those left, so that happens a little bit sooner too. So we'll press 0 now for a preview, and yeah, I think that looks pretty good, so I'm happy with that. Now that's our base explosion done, and what we want to happen next is for it to kind of get to a critical radius and then fizzle out. Now we'll achieve that by using a mask. I'll stop our animation, and I'll close all this down on the ring layer, and we'll do a new solid, and we'll call this one mask. So we're going to use the circle effect again. So we're going to drag that onto our layer, and you can see the new circle appear here. Now if I turn off the ring layer for the time being, you can see it's now on transparent. And we can increase the radius now up to, well, it's quite large and almost filling our composition. And I'm just going to add a slight feathering to the edge too. You can see, as before, that the circle has now made the layer transparent. So it doesn't matter what you set your solid's colour to be, and the circle will always turn the layer transparent. Now I'm going to invert our circle, and so that you can see what's going on, I'm going to change it from white to this dark red. To see what's happening, I'll turn back on the ring layer, and as I scrub you can see our explosion come up and get obliterated by the mask. So I'll press 0 and we can have a RAM player. And you can see it comes out, and where it hits the mask, it fades away. I'll now change the colour back to black, and then again if I do a RAM play, you'll see effectively what is 90% of the way there, and with our explosion. Certainly the timing is there, and we just need to add a few more little effects to get the details in. So let's start by adding some texture. So again, I'm going to create a new solid, and we'll call this one noise. So in effects and presets, search for fractal noise, and we'll drag that onto our new solid. And what I want to do is I want to animate this using evolution. So I'm going to drag the timeline slider back to frame 0, and I'm going to click the little stopwatch next to evolution to add a keyframe. Select your noise layer and press U, which will expand anything with a keyframe on, and you can see our first frame. I'm going to drag the slider now all the way to the end, and now you can actually drag the evolution value to whatever it is that you want to have for your motion. Again, you can come back to the start frame and you can press 0 to get a RAM play, and you can get an idea of how the animation looks. And like with all the things in this tutorial, you can adjust these to suit your requirements. So I want my noise to be a little bit larger than this, so I'm going to go to transform and scale, and just set that to what I need. And then going to the layer itself, I'm going to change the blend mode to overlay. And now you can see this is being applied over our explosion and adding some texture to our explosion. So we're getting to a point that's fairly similar to the fiery ring tutorial that I mentioned earlier. However, I want my ring to be more smooth, so I'm going to add CC radial blur. So find that in your effects and drag that onto the layer. So I found that and I'll drag it onto my layer, and I'm going to change the type to centered zoom. And then as I increase the amount, you'll see that it starts to give us this very nice sort of iris style effect. So as I'm scrubbing through, I'm seeing that my edges look a little bit too woolly on the outer edge than I would prefer. So this is down to the feathering on the lower circle layer. So I'm going to select that layer and press U to expand. And you can see we have some existing keyframes already near the start. So I'm going to line up with that. And then I'm going to bring my feathered edge down to where it seems a little bit more how I want it to look. And as I scrub through, I can see that even at the start it's still a little bit woolly, so I will go to frame 0 and again bringing that down to 0. And as I scrub through now, you can see it's starting to look pretty nice. And this is it now. We're at the point where you can start fine-tuning and scrubbing back and forth, because we're pretty much 95% of the way there. So looking at the ramp layer now, it's really looking quite nice, and the only thing I would change is the circle in the centre. I actually want to be a little bit smaller, and that's kind of difficult to do now with the circle parameters due to the way that they interact. So I'm going to do this using an adjustment layer. We select New and Adjustment Layer, and then in Effects and Presets we'll search for Bulge and pop that onto our layer. Now in order to see what this does, we'll drag the time slider to where our energy ring is at its prime again. So we'll just drag that to about here. If we adjust horizontal radius here to just where it's about touching the outside of the ring, and then do the same with vertical radius. And then if we adjust the bulge height, and you can see that drags the centre in. Now if you do this too far, it will actually sort of rip it apart, and that can create, you know, some very interesting effects, and indeed you could use that here. But that's not what I'm going for. All I want at this stage is to just bring in my centre and kind of drag out the streaks a little bit. We've used horizontal radius, vertical radius and bulge height. Now I'm going to add tracks or keyframes for each of these, so clicking. And then if I select the layer and press U, you can see our keyframes have been created. So now I'm just going to scrub our timeline just at various points, and then I'm just going to adjust the horizontal radius and the vertical radius so that they kind of follow the motion of our energy ring as it expands. So I'll just do this in another position along the timeline. And again at the start position, and it's probably easier for me here to just type in the values of 0 and 0. And now as we scrub, you can see our effect follows the warp ring pretty well. So I'm just going to do a RAM play and check that I'm happy, and that's all looking pretty good. So we're now going to call that done, and we'll look now at how we drop all of this into a composition. So now I have a background composition that I want to add my explosion to. Now this has been created simply using After Effects lens flares and Starfield effects. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my ring explosion and drag it into the composition. Now using the transform scale, we'll get it so that we can get the whole thing into view. There we go. Now the other thing as well that's worth mentioning at this point is that when you're doing compositions of things, particularly that are going to involve glows, etc., is that you set your composition settings to 32 bits per pixel, and that's done here. And this would just improve all the compositions with, if you're using screen or add and features like that. It won't stop you exporting out an 8-bit video at the end, but it does just improve dramatically your composition results. With that said, I'm going to change my blend mode to add, and now you can see our Ring of Doom is transparent. And I'm going to add now a curves adjustment layer. So we go to effects and search for curves. Dragging the curves onto the effects channel, we can now fine tune this, and you see we can make it either quite harsh, or by adjusting we can make it kind of get smoky and ethereal. And that's kind of the look that I'm going for in this particular example, but yours may vary, so adjust your curves to suit. Next we're going to add the tritone effect, so search for that and drag that onto your layer. Now this works by setting colours for the brightness of any particular layer. So we've got the highlights, in this case will be white. Here's what the mid-grey will be coloured, and then you've got the shadows. So I want to set mine to be more blue, but again, you set yours for what you want. And the curves will help, the curve level above will help distribute what goes where. You can tailor this quite precisely, and I think this kind of works for me. So next we're going to add a glow effect, so we'll drop that onto the effects channel, and we can adjust the glow intensity, and you can see that will actually make it quite harsh. Adjusting the glow threshold is, at the moment you can see it's set to 60%, so anything more than 60% bright is getting the glow. So we'll crank up that number so that only the very highest points are being glowed. And then the glow radius is sort of how far the spread of the glow will go. So here you can see you can get it looking quite neon. So I dial these settings to get the kind of look that I want. Yeah, that's not bad. Yeah, I think that's getting pretty good. So all that's left now is to actually place my ring in the scene in the correct perspectives. If not visible already, hit this toggle down here so that you can see these buttons, and select the 3D mode for our layer. And then with rotate turned on up here, you can now rotate the layer, the composition, in our scene. This is all starting to look pretty good, and I want to add a bit more perspective, so we're going to add a camera. So we're going new, camera, and I'm going to select the 24mm for wide angle. and that just adds a bit more punch. And then I'm going to go to transform and scale of our ring kaboom. Just bring it up so it's large in the frame, and now just positioning it to where it suits my needs. So I'll just create a little RAM play, and I think that's looking pretty good now. That's how we would do a Praxis effect on a static background. We'll just very quickly now have a look at how to integrate it in with a scene that would have an animating camera. Here is my animated scene out of 3D Studio Max, and as you can see as well, I've added some lighting that's going to sort of reflect where the Praxis ring is going to be. And the way I did that is by creating some stand-in geometry for the objects in the scene. So there's a ball and a ring, and I set those to emit light but not be visible to camera in the final render. This preview was actually directly from the viewports in 3ds Max, so it meant I could export it very quickly and I could get working in After Effects while the 3ds Max scene was actually doing its rendering. So I simply then brought in the ring in exactly the same way I did for the static scene, and now I just had keyframes for position and for scale, and you can see here how few I actually did. So I set them by eyeball, and I did it in exactly the same way as we did the bulge animation, just sliding and adjusting. And the fewer frames you have, the smoother the whole composition will be. Once I was happy that I got it following the geometry, the stand-in geometry from Max, I could turn off that layer and replace it with another layer that still from the viewport in Max, but now had kind of all the final geometry. And now I worked out masking because I wanted my ring to go behind the music note. So I added masks again just by eye, and using as few keyframes as possible, just kept them moving to follow the shape of the music note. And because glow works outside the mask, it glowed around the music note as you would expect it to. Masking is outside of the realms of this tutorial, but there are plenty of good tutorials out there. And then once the 3D Studio Max renders had finished, I could replace the stand-in frames with the final renders. And now a quick RAM preview shows us the final result. All that was left now was to composite this into the rest of the animation. So please go and check this out. There's a link here for the full music defeating the virus animation. And that's all for this tutorial. I hope you learned something from it and it was useful to you guys. If so, give me a like, and I'll catch you all on the next one. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.